Yeah, tēnā koutou katoa, I'm Selwyn Manning, and welcome to this episode, which is number 4 in the series of 6 of A View from Afar podcast. And for this episode of A View from Afar, political scientist and former Pentagon analyst Paul Buchanan and I, well, we're going to deep dive into the issues underlying the Xi Jinping-Trump summit meeting and traverse those big issues, those huge issues, man-made or otherwise, that will pose significant challenges in 2026 and beyond. And like we know, and in particular from previous episodes of A View from Afar, we've discussed how geopolitics is shifting. There are new alliances that have been forming, and there's cooperation between, really, quite frankly, unlikely nations. And it seems to be, and very much we've detailed this as a phenomenon, it's detailing and traversing toward a new and different world. But what we're looking at today is quite interesting, I think. So we're going to be looking at what are the power kind of energies behind such shifts, and how man-made conflicts, for example, impacting on progress, but also what are the consequences of climate change with such powerful and destructive headwinds. How can we all adapt and progress? And that's us as individuals. We all know the cost of living crisis, if you like, is washed over many countries. But there are other things too to look at, like industry adaptability within business interests and things like that, the economy in general, the geo-economy and the scale of geopolitics and how that intersects with all of this. But anyway, how is progress possible in today's environment? So let's deep dive into these issues with Paul Buchanan, and we'll take the conversation perhaps to a deeper level of understanding. That's our intention today. But before we kick off this new episode, remember that if you are joining us live via the social media platforms, you can feel free to comment, as we can include your comments and questions in this program, but be aware of that. And especially we encourage you, if you wish to join us on YouTube. Give us a like, and obviously subscribe to our channel there, because YouTube is very, very interactive, and it's especially efficient in that way. So we really encourage that. With all that said and done, the beginning of the program, beginning of this episode, let's cross to Paul Buchanan, who is waiting online to discuss some of these, or all of these big, deep issues. Kia ora, tēnā koe, Paul. How are you going today?
Very well, Selwyn. Kia ora to you and the audience. Hey, buddy, it looks like it's pretty cold over where you live.
Yeah.
Paul. I don't know. Go ahead.
Like Paul knows, but many of you listeners don't. We live quite a long way away comparatively from a point of view of an island nation, and there's quite big differences in temperatures. And Paul's having a bit of a jab and a laugh at that. I'm wrapped up so that my teeth don't chatter into the microphone, Paul. That's the plan.
Yeah, he usually gets the better of me, because where I live is basically a subtropical rainforest.
Yeah.
One of the colder parts in winter in the Auckland area, and he's down in, the sunny Hawke's Bay, and where's the Bay of Plenty?
Hawke's Bay region, yeah. So it's always pretty hot and dry down here in the summer months, but of course we're heading into winter now in this part of the world, and like Paul knows, it can get pretty cold here, but not as cold as the South Island. So remember, the further south you go in the southern hemisphere, the colder it gets, and that's what we're talking about here. Yeah, Paul, we've got some interesting stuff. We've had a leaders summit between the two big powers in the world that's just concluded. We also, underneath that, I think it's quite interesting to look at what is the energy, what is the power behind what we are seeing in a geopolitical space. And I suppose it's really important. There's 3 main things that you've raised with me before the program: and geopolitics, institutional lag, and industrial resilience. And I thought maybe we can start by just looking at that and knowing where we're going with it, perhaps.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to create 3 categories. and link them together in a chain of causality, with starting out with geopolitical change, moving to institutional lag, which you and I have talked about before with regards to espionage and intelligence gathering, and then get into industrial resilience, because that's one of the new buzzwords that is being bandied about in the global system of trade. And so we'll get to that. But I'd like to start off in a lighter tone about symmetry and geopolitical language, because I thought we had this incredible study of contrasts in the meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump and their respective entourages. And it was encapsulated for me by the following exchange. And the backdrop is they had their first business meeting. And so you see the tables, across from each other, and there's the whole delegation. The two principals are sitting 10 feet apart, giving each other the eyeball. And Trump starts talking about the popularity of Chinese food in the United States and how Chinese restaurants are so popular, apparently not recognizing that there are regional cuisines in China. It's not all Panda Express. Anyway, so this guy is just gibberish about Chinese food. I mean, I really thought we were going to go in to some racist tropes with this dude, given that his mental state is a little suspect. And so there you have his vision of the relationship between the United States and this other great power. Uh, and then you get Xi Jinping stand up, wars, which was basically 100 plus year of war between Sparta and Athens. Those things happened. They're real. And so Thucydides wrote the definitive history. And in it, I mean, he has all sorts of interesting observations that are pertinent.
We're back, Paul. Your connection dropped off from the platform, so apologise to the audience for that. But we'll pick up just where you were talking about the context and the performance of otherwise how you define Donald Trump interacting there with Xi Jinping and the leaders' summit between the two powers.
Right. So Trump talks about the popularity of Chinese food in the United States. Xi Jinping gets up and talks about the Thucydides trap. And I was pointing out that Thucydides was the historian of the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens. And I think when we dropped, I was talking about the Melian dilemma, which is New Zealand confronts it in dealing with the United States and China competition in the Western Pacific. Basically, the plight of small states that are being pressured by bigger powers. It's basically that. Well, the Thucydides trap refers, and again, we've actually talked a lot about this, but without mentioning Thucydides, is the moment where an established great power attempts to thwart and resist the rise of newer powers. And so we've talked about rising and declining powers in a multipolar world, and that's part of the transition. What we talked about in the past was, and the systems regulator in those moments of transition is conflict. And that's exactly what Thucydides said. He said basically, the great power will initiate conflict in order to prevent these rising powers from becoming the threat that it thinks they could be. And that raises a whole side literature about the so-called security dilemma, where you see a country arming and you arm yourself because you think they're going to do you harm. They see you arming and they go, oh, this guy's out to get us. And so they arm, and then you have an arms race. Well, Xi Jinping is telling Trump to his face that he should move carefully. He cautioned against falling into the Thucydides trap. This is a level of sophistication that Trump simply does not have.
Yeah.
And I can imagine his advisors after the Chinese food, he went on for 5 minutes about Chinese food, is truly phenomenal, but it also speaks to how different leaders and, I would say, strategic cultures look at the geopolitical map of the world. And so that sort of prompted me to say, okay, that's the hook in current events that Selwyn and I can use to sort of describe this, the backdrop to the entire process. So let's go very quickly about what is geopolitics. Geopolitics, in a sentence, is the relationship between geography and politics. Now, this is international politics, so it involves the use of military force, it involves international trade, those sort of things. But it's the relationship of the human to the immutable features of geography. And so, traditionally, littoral states that are on the shorelines of narrow waterways through which trade and commerce and whatnot pass through, they have a strategic advantage because they're right there. They can fortify and they can intercept, commercial traffic, thwart adversaries from transiting. I mean, I always think of the Bosphorus Straits separating the two sides of Istanbul. Turkey controls that thing, but it allows freedom of navigation. Now, just to anticipate something I'm going to say, that may change very soon as a result of the toll booth system now operative in the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, but we'll get to that. Now, there's two problems, or two updates, I would say, to traditional geopolitical theory. And I mean, again, the literature on this in the strategic studies field is immense. There are continental-based geopolitical theories of power projection where you have large land masses. Countries with large land masses will have large standing armies, and they will use those armies and the mass of those armies to invade their neighbors, impose their will. Maritime nations will have naval geopolitical strategies that emphasize control of the sea lanes of communication. And so they put a premium on naval forces. The traditional case is Great Britain during the heyday of colonialism. And now in the 20th century and 21st century, there's air domination geopolitical theory, which incidentally, the United States happens to subscribe to for reasons we've talked about before, but involve a faith in technology, not wanting deaths on the American side, so you just attack from above and get out of the way. The no boots on the grounds thing.
Yeah.
And so that's the military applications. But there are two more fundamental aspects that are clearly changing. Uh, One is human, and the other one is natural. First of all, I'll start with the natural. First of all, geography is not immutable. Climate change has ended all that. You no longer have geographic features that remain permanent
Yeah.
uh, forever.
Yeah.
A clear example in point: the melting of the Arctic Ocean ice and the opening of the Northern Passage, which has set off a geopolitical race, not only between Russia, who's ahead of everybody else, but of Nordic countries, of Great Britain, of the United States and Canada, of course, and the PRC.
Mm.
Everybody's making a run because there are minerals in that ocean. And strategically, if you're up at the top of the globe in terms of having your missiles, submarine launched missiles against adversaries, that's the best place to be. So, and again, the Russians are way ahead. They've even put plaque markers on the ocean floor claiming it as Russian territory. Okay, so like, don't come in here. So that's an example where nature has now taken over certain geographic features. The other one is the rising sea levels and the corresponding drought and wet cycles, which are turning some deserts into floodplains during rainy seasons and turning some wet countries or wet regions, let's say like the Mekong Delta, into dry patches, arid lands.
This is something that some of the readers, some of the audience may kind of think, and it certainly tweaked with me just then. That saw reports last week relating to once were desert areas in Iraq that are returning back to wetlands. So that's a significant illustration of what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're right now in a hybrid moment where we still have features like the Strait of Hormuz or the Malaccan Straits. I mean, right now, everybody's thinking about waterways and trade, and fair enough for that. But we're having, as a result of these climatic shifts, and if people want to deny climate science and whatnot, it's just they're ostriches, looking for deeper sand, because this is here to stay, and it's changing geopolitical relationships. Countries that didn't matter a lot or didn't have resources all of a sudden are becoming prized focuses of attention for, let's say, high tech. All these data banks, solar energy, what used to be, arid deserts, the Arabian deserts, nothing out there, are now prized commodities in the post-industrial age. So the value of the nation states that have those areas has gone from 0 to 100. I mean, people now want to get out there. So even the natural landscape in the geopolitical equation is starting to change. In fact, I mentioned the Arctic. In the Antarctic, the ice shelf is melting and the ice cover on the continent is melting. So there again, there is a race on to exploit minerals in violation of all international conventions. Again, rules and norms just got pitched out the window now that stuff is accessible, and so on and so forth. But there's another half to this, and then the human half. Our technological advancements in the last 30 years, but certainly in the last 15, have been so exponential, so industrial scale changing, that we can now exploit geography in a way we never could. I mean, think of space travel, think of undersea travel. And I'll give you an example. The country of Fiji, Melanesian country, by and large known for its tourism, right? It's got a good surf break, pretty benign climate if you like warmth, and an interesting mix of people. But otherwise, it was a stopover to somewhere else. Well, guess what? The main fiber optic trunk cables that connect Los Angeles with Sydney have a stopover terminus in Nadi, the capital of Fiji. It emerges from the ocean there so they can do repair and maintenance and what have you. And it's controlled by a consortium of countries, consumer countries, that use the fiber optic cable. All of what we're doing here is fed off of that cable, okay? Because it splinters off, it goes to Tonga, Samoa, but it comes here.
Yeah.
And the terminus here comes off on the North Shore of Auckland.
It does.
Now,
yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that's interesting is Fiji receives a disproportionate amount of military, particularly naval traffic, every day of the year. There's someone visiting. And one of the aspects,
and because of the coups of the past and the transition away from coup leadership to a form of democracy, we've seen Fiji have connections to different powers: Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, reaching out to the United States, of course, Australia and New Zealand, and its Melanesian spearhead group nations, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, etc. So it's an interesting location in itself, isn't it, within the blue continent, as we'd call it.
Right, but under previous technological regimes, it would have been merely a political focus. Well, what I'm referring to is there's an acute technological focus on Fiji. And let's just put it this way. I've seen many credible reports that there is an unusually high volume of submarine traffic in and around Fiji. Why is that? Well, it turns out military submarines are the best vehicles for tapping into that cable for intelligence collection purposes, for intercepting the cable for sabotage purposes. A lot of mischief can happen, as we've seen in the Baltic Sea, where, fiber optic cables were cut, obviously as part of the Ukraine-Russian conflict. We've even had cables cut in Tonga, in literally the port, outside of the port, the main port in Tonga, is a Chinese trawler just happened to be dragging anchor and cut the main cable back to Fiji. And we had no idea. So basically put the lights out in terms of internet on those guys, including, the consulates of Western countries and that sort of thing. My point being is our technologies are changing what the very definition of geopolitics is. You include space now. And again, I've been talking about, the sea and what have you. And so we need to understand that this post-liberal order that we've talked about quite a bit is going to include if not a redefinition, a reframing of what geopolitics is about, the relationship between humans and geography that is changing, and the power relationships that are created as a result of the geopolitical changes. And that, I think, is going to get very, very interesting in a hurry. We can already see it with the proliferation of AI data centers in the Middle East, particularly amongst the petroleum oligarchies. They're going full on to AI storage because they have solar power. And they have, apparently, most of these countries have fairly good aquifers, but they're deep underground. Well, now we can reach them in a measure that we could not in the past. So the game is changing. The principles remain the same. The relationship between your place on Earth and your ability to project power in pursuit of your national interests. Okay, that's an immutable principle. But the specifics are now changing and changing at fairly high speed. Well, that brings up the second part of the conversation, which is institutional lag.
Yeah.
The institutional lag comes out of the management literature. And it's a really simple principle. It says that complex organizations, there's a gap between a technological advance or a significant event and the institutional response to it. Complex organizations, because of the money invested, the inertia, if you will, the corporate inertia, are slow to react to fast-moving events.
I'd just like to speak to a couple of those points. I mean, it's an interesting thing. And yeah, there's the old song about New York, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. Well, yeah, it's a big scale type of observation that. There's a flip side to that too. If you're in a small place, if you can make it in a small place, make it however you want to define that. That's a challenge too. And that's an interesting one. What I'd say here is if you go back to the late 1980s, even mid to late 1980s, there was huge technological advancements, if you like, in the cell phone kind of areas, mobile phones, people, consumer demand was ratcheting up. Technology was kind of holding that and growing with that and developing at the same time. New Zealand didn't have the scale to do this, major kind of technological advancements. But where it became interesting was these big giants from overseas tested their technologies in the smaller consumer markets of a country like New Zealand. And we saw GMS kind of stuff. We saw, the sharing of a device between text and voice. All of these things starting to change. Even now, we've seen the same advancements. Some would argue where New Zealand has been the recipient of a lot of this technological advancement off scale in larger economies back on our own shores with respect to the uptake of big data, even AI, if you like. So it's an interesting phenomenon that you do see here. And what I'm getting at is speaking right to that point of institutional lag as opposed to the resilience elements that we will talk about it later. That lag of big organizations where they're aware or maybe even a part of the development of such major iconic moments can't respond because they're big, they're giant. So if you think of it in a physical sense, they're cumbersome in some respects, whereas small outfits that can be nimble-footed and agile in their positioning, even indicating to the bigger giants where market sustainability can happen. I'm talking in a technological consumer kind of area. That is an interesting case where, we see this. The institutional lag is a real thing. I suppose even in the smaller economies like New Zealand, we'd point to the big outfits like government being slow to respond to the needs of the public, slow to respond to the technological opportunities, developing policies that make sense of that kind of advancement, and certainly missing a lot of the opportunities of developing policy to benefit from it. So I just wanted to put that in there too, Paul, where there's you can see that there is a juxtapositioning of geo interests, if you like, by way of scale in some of these issues as well.
No, I think it made me think. It's funny. So that bit about, if you make it in New York, you can make it anywhere and all of that. I'm actually living proof of the reverse. I'm a guy who did fairly well in the United States, both in scholarship and in government service. Big country, a lot of competition for the things that I did. And I was quite pleased with myself. And I immigrated here for reasons that had nothing to do with scholarship. I did want to stay in government, but personal circumstances were such that I couldn't at the time. But I arrived here, and people said to me, "Oh, well, you're a former Fulbrighter and counsel on foreign relations. You're going to just sweep the floor with these people." What I found instead was an incredibly parochial, sometimes provincial, jealous resistance to everything I had done before. And oftentimes, when New Zealanders are in a better mood than usual, in a self depreciating way, they will say that's the tall poppy syndrome.
Yeah.
If you're a tall poppy, you get snipped. That happened to me. I was told, you'll never make it with our intelligence services, even though I had a lot of things that I could have contributed. I found myself blocked from getting on professional journal editorial boards because I was just another opinionated Yank, even though my publication record would have indicated. Even found some promotion weirdness in the university. And I realized that explains why a lot of New Zealanders, talented New Zealanders, leave, but then they come back because they can come back at a higher level and they're still part of the in crowd. See, we're a country that's run by cliques, and it's part of being so small. I said to my American son yesterday, I was saying, we're 3 degrees of separation from anyone else in New Zealand. And so you run into old girlfriends, we're a pretty small country in that regard. Well, in the professions, it's intense. They don't want you in if you're not one of them. And I have felt this in spades. Now, I chose to come here. This is not a whinge. I've met people like you. And so I'm like, well, there is talent out there. But, we know that universities, academia is a neurotic profession. And so, it is what it is. But I think you're absolutely right in this sense. Smaller places may have that flexibility, if nothing else, to serve as really good laboratory rats for products developed in the North.
And we saw it with
We do have,
neoliberalism as well, didn't we? That New Zealand basically was seduced into embracing neoliberalism back in the late 80s, mid 80s.
well, that's just, yeah. And I think, you're onto something because it depends on the product. See, we're laboratory rats for things like credit cards and the electronic swipey devices. All that got trialed here.
Yeah, you would have
I don't
noticed
think,
that when you got here that there were things like that, accessing the hotel rooms with a card
yes.
many years before other places. Not that we invented these things, but we were the trialing.
Right, but the other side. So on technical or technological issues, small is quick, small is fast, small is responsive. When you get, if you have your methodology right, you study 1,000 New Zealanders and their, let's say, consumer habits, and you make sure that you've got a demographic that includes Maori, Pacifica, Chinese, all the different groups, including Pakeha New Zealanders. And then you run your lab tests, your product testing. And it gives you a pretty good idea because we're a literate society. We're a cultured society. We're not primitive per se, at least not in the cities. And so you can extrapolate methodologically sound conclusions from the small sample survey that is, let's say, 1,000 people or whatnot. It's valid. It's valid social science. Now, I would say that that does not apply to other aspects of social science or the humanities, in that once you get into the realm of human behavior, those sort of things outside of consumer logics, then it gets, it becomes more idiosyncratic.
Yeah, I
And
agree very
so,
much. Yeah, particularly
yeah,
since we
well,
keep referring to the 80s, and I think that was a watershed decade for many places on Earth, but also significantly in New Zealand. Economic upheavals, the testing of neoliberal economics, where New Zealand was going to remain diplomatically in its place in the world within the multilateral body structures. There were many, many things, but what we did see was generations after that that individualized their response to issues, social issues, political issues, and there's the old adage: is some say, and many in the activist community say it was a lost generation. So there's interesting kind of observations that are far beyond my what do people say? Stick in your lane. Those kind of observations are outside my lane, but they're coming from a layperson's kind of point of view as opposed to sociologist, anthropologist, psychological kind of point of view.
yeah, but you're a good observer of social phenomena. So I'll take your opinions. No, but look at you brought up another good point there. So let's think of neoliberalism as an institution, right? A framework of behavior that was imposed in the 80s on New Zealand. Now, normally, and I admit that I have a Keynesian, if not socialist type background, the reasoning, and Uruguay is a good example of this, in small countries, you don't want to adopt economic policies that increase income disparities, that is, widen the gap between rich and poor, because the spillover effects are rises in crime, rises in or declines in human social indicators like mortality rates, and that sort of thing. So the general idea is in small countries, you've got to get along, no place else to go to. And so your policies are more welfare statist, they're more benign because you all got to get along. New Zealand turned that on its head, went with brutal neoliberal policies, yanked the welfare mat out from under, and let's face it, we have an underclass that is predominantly brown, and it has continued to this day. In fact, some of the crowd that's running the show today still believe that neoliberalism is the bomb while they enrich themselves and their corporate cronies at the expense of the rest of us. Now, here's the last point.
There's institutional lag and evidence there, isn't it? And from the point of view of, exactly that, I think illustrates it very well. That New Zealand is still within that vice, that mindset, where it cannot start to take the vice out and release that kind of pressure. Generally, irrespective of governments and their new incoming governments that may say that they're going to embrace a transitional period here economically and socially, you find that their ambitions are exsanguinated, if you want to put it that way. They're bled out of them by the time they've really got their feet under the desk. So it's an interesting thing in that respect here in New Zealand. And then why I jumped in on this was even to illustrate what you're talking about, Paul, that the lost generation that we're talking about from the point of view of activist communities is also economic. The OECD reports going back 10 years ago and through to now are always underscoring the fact that there is a lost opportunity with population here. And you mentioned it in an underclass. Even OECD reports referring to the lack of opportunity, the lack of policy that leads to a person realizing their potential. And I would say that the experiment of neoliberalism, that experiment lives on. And if any countries there wish to look at the consequences of it, they can see it here in New Zealand in different areas of estrangement from the common way. So it's an interesting kind of observation. That institutional lag, the people have had a gutsful, basically, haven't they? And the pandemic of COVID showed us that institutional lag was no longer going to fit it, meaning the orthodoxies, that we had to adopt some other way. But this segues into your talk too, because it was short-lived, wasn't it?
It was. There, look at it, you can credit the neoliberal crowd with being able to implement a very flawed economic policy, implement it, turn it into a social policy, and in doing so, engage in some social engineering where 20-year-olds today do not look at themselves the way 20-year-olds did in your time or my time. That is, they have less solidarity ties. They're more egocentric, individualistic. Some might say high achievers, but they're in it for the money. It's a social phenomenon. So you give them credit because they were able to imbue the fabric of society with this new ethos, even though I happen to think it's terrible. Now, the trouble is, most of the civilized world abandoned neoliberalism 20 years ago and started doing mixed market models and that sort of thing, taking what they thought was the best, but returning public goods into the equation, things like welfare, healthcare, that should not
Stimulus.
be left. What's
Stimulus.
that?
Economic stimulus. All of these things that leverage up potential in times of requirement.
Yeah, some economic sectors are ripe for private enterprise, and then some are not. And some, I would say, healthcare. These are, you need to look at the money spent on them as investments in your society. You're not going to get a return, in cash. It's in a well-educated, healthier society. You just got to change the mindset. But that's what's so hard to do now. And the fact is, and I would hate to say it because we are in an election year here in New Zealand, but until labor gets off of the neoliberal mindset, see, they're still trying to do third way type thing, Tony Blair type of stuff. And it's like, guys, it's over. Okay, you got to come up with something that is a crystal clear alternative to this weird mixed libertarian, Adam Smithian, Milton Friedman strangeness that is actually, if you look at social indicators in New Zealand over the last 20 years, there's been dramatic declines in a lot of those social indicators. Even though GDP per capita grows and all the macros may look good, and the country is stable. But it seems to me that that paradigm shift is long overdue in New Zealand, but no one's quite, none of the institutions that can affect the change are either able or willing to do so in the near future.
Because of institutional lag.
And that's the institutional lag that we see across the board. Again, it's all complex organizations, be they political, military. I mean, again, you and I have talked about the intelligence services. And there's that old phrase that today's generals are always planning for yesterday's wars, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, let's think of it of the attack here on March 15th, 2019. The yearly intelligence threat assessment issued in January of that year said that the biggest threat to New Zealand were Islamicists and then Chinese hackers and influence operations. The Chinese stuff, fairly accurate. Islamicists, there's never been a single act of politically motivated mass violence in New Zealand ever committed by a Muslim. None. But these guys took 9/11, they ran it, they got funding, and they invented stuff. Meanwhile, a right wing extremist
From
moves
Australia.
here, but interestingly, from Australia,
Yeah.
because Australia had stricter gun laws than New Zealand. After the Port Arthur massacre, Australia really tightened up its gun laws. New Zealand's like, yeah, nah, we'll just
Well,
let it go.
I was a part of this element of it. New Zealand had its equivalent to Port Arthur at Aramoana. And out of that
Right.
came a thing called the Thorpe Report. And in many aspects of that, it mirrored what the Australians had done. It really required them to put their buck where their mouth was. They wanted to control gun laws, but a big part of that in the Thorpe Report that came out was that they had to establish a buyback. There was an economic response as well. The New Zealand governments, or new governments, or the Labour Alliance governments, came in the late 1999 and through under Helen Clark's period. They couldn't scratch together the fiscal commitment to the buyback, and the Thorpe Report in large was not adopted. That took that massacre you were referring to, where a white supremacist hater from Australia came to New Zealand because he saw an opportunity to gather guns on a massive scale, and then committed the worst atrocity that we have seen in our lifetimes. And that is a real lesson. What happened? Within weeks, the legislature, the parliament, had the opportunity, some cynics would say, but they moved very quickly, broke institutional lag on this particular issue through necessity and pragmatism, and put across a bill that became law in record time and was adopted by all parties in the parliament except for the very extreme Liberal Party, the ACT Party, which is one of the three parties in coalition government at the moment.
Yeah, unfortunately, the horse had bolted by that point. But it's good to reference the institutional lag part, because on the one hand, the New Zealand institutions were slow to react to the previous massacre in New Zealand, but also the Australian example. Just didn't react until March 15th. The other one, interestingly, is that, again, they were focused at Islamicists. As I said elsewhere at the time, they were focused on the victims, not the perpetrator. And I say that because they were spending a lot of time surveilling the Muslim community in New Zealand. It's about 50,000 people, including undercover operatives in the mosques. They did the full blanket approach. Again, the tenor of the times, I can live with that. You'd rather be cautious than not. But New Zealand has this well-known history of right-wing extremism, neo-Nazis, weirdos of all sorts, centered in Christchurch, of all places. And they did nothing. They did nothing. They knew these guys were out there. In fact, it's unfortunately the Royal Commission on these events was a total whitewash, because they were told that there were some dudes at a gun club outside of Dunedin shooting up silhouettes with Arab-looking figures and talking all sorts of trash. One of them was the killer, the eventual killer, but there were other people there. And an ex-New Zealand Army soldier reported it to the cops. He was so alarmed by what these guys were saying as they were shooting, and they were shooting automatic, semi-automatic weapons. Cops ignored him, just ignored him. I actually had a conversation with the counterterrorism head of the New Zealand police in the early 20-teens. And I said to him, look, you guys are really obsessed with Islamicists. But what about all these right-wing nutters? And his response to me was, oh, they're just a bunch of clowns. And I'm like, yeah, but they're like those evil clowns. They could still hurt you. He just dismissed it. He said, we don't focus on those guys. Well, guess what? Well,
Mm.
they're inventing imaginary reasons to watch Muslims, and there are Muslim hotheads in New Zealand. Young men who are just fired up, but they haven't made any moves of any significance, and so they ignored this looming threat because the murderer had connections to drug gangs. He had come up on their radar for other reasons, and they never thought to check into him. Never do a double check. And like when he did the gun license, they never thought to look into his financials. It turns out, had they done that, this is 2017, they would have realized that he was buying up large quantities of military-style bullets, disproportionate to any hunting purpose. They found that all later.
Yeah.
And so I think, okay, there was a lag in institutional vetting. There was a lag in threat perception. You're too wedded to what the Americans told you the threat was after 9/11, because
And
we do
Britain.
get.
So remember that, two significant players, probably the most significant players in the Five Eyes intelligence network is Britain, the United Kingdom, and
Yeah.
the United States. Britain is much more focused on Islamic perceived and it's clear has been real threat from communities on its own soil. But New Zealand and Australia have been obviously sensitive to this. Australia's had its problems too. And one would argue, I suppose, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, it's not that they should stop, perhaps, have looking to prevent things from occurring in a country like New Zealand, but it's one where they were tunnel visioned on what they were looking at. And so therefore creating the threat to seduce really the political apparatus and the vote intelligence money that would go across at budget time. So that's a bit of a cynical response to it, but one from a practical point of view too. When we're looking at all of this, we've really identified institutional lag. Certainly we've identified, and it's our bread and butter, isn't it, in many respects, the geopolitics. Let's look at industrial resilience. In my way of thinking, Paul, this illustrates not just that for industry and business, but also for households, for people that are trying to actually adapt to changing times that are beyond their control.
Yeah. Okay. So the segue would be this: at a macro level, we're seeing institutional lag on a grand scale where the U.S., its former Western partners, are not letting go of the idea that the geopolitical world has changed forever. Specifically, that freedom of navigation and the international rules and norms of the liberal order are no more. Okay, we're moving back to a neo-mercantilist age where countries that control waterways and choke points and transportation hubs, be they airports and whatnot, will exercise their power to leverage that geographic advantage for
Clicking the
whatever reason.
ticket in a benign sense, it's clicking the ticket, but that's
Right there. I mean, the Indonesian finance minister has said he likes the idea of a toll system, but what they'll do is they will call it a maintenance fee collected by a tripartite board of Indonesian, Singaporean, and Malaysian authorities who will charge everyone going through the Malaccan Straits a maintenance fee to keep the dredging operations open and what have you. As it turns out, Japan already pays a dredging fee. They just do it on the side. And that tripartite commission is already set up just to manage the waterway. It's I think we're about to see a reimposition of the toll system on a lot of choke points, but not exclusively waterways. Again, some of these regional hubs and what have you. You may start seeing premiums extracted because it's the fastest way to get from here to there. Let's say going through Doha, from here to get to Europe, a stop in the Middle East is, the most economical and what have you. They may start taking advantage of that. But it gets to the point of industrial resilience. So that's the macro, if you will, the strategic level play. And they're not getting it. They're not getting it. They're not the game as it was played is over. The first shot in the trade regime was the pandemic disruptions. But here's where things get interesting in terms of so-called resilience. It was expected, and you and I talked at some length about this, that seeing that commodity production was overly concentrated, especially in China, consumer durables and non-durables, but that there was too much concentration of production in very specific states. And that this thing disrupted all of that. And that was on top of business models that included the just-in-time model, which is you just produce the orders that you got last week. You don't stockpile inventory and have them available in case there's a surge in demand. That model ended, in my father's age, the industrial age. And so that compounded the problem. Well, the thought was, okay, we're going to go to more flexible trade systems, including nearshoring, friendshoring, regional hub and spokes instead of, long cross-ocean things. And you know what? 70 to 80% of international businesses went back to the old status quo as soon as the crest of the pandemic eased off. They went back to business as usual. Why? Because of all the, the sunken costs in the systems that they had. They didn't want to give that up for something new and have to spend the money to do alternatives. Now, so that was the first nail, death nail, if you will. Now we've got the war. Again, a war of aggression started by a geopolitically ignorant administration that has backfired spectacularly. And we can get into this if you want, but the U.S. has lost.
Yeah.
There isn't a realist in the
We
world.
discussed this in previous episodes. And
yeah, they lost.
And I think where we landed is on the base plate that Israel's lost the medium and long-term role here too. That the shift in the United States tolerance of being exploited when it has a weak White House or administration is no longer tolerable to the masses. And it appears that is showing through in every poll that is even touching on these particular issues. But wanted to add that in.
Yeah. No, fair enough. And it'll take the midterms to bring that to a resolution. But business resilience, again, it's a buzzword these days. It basically means it's management speak for adaptability and flexibility in production and process. And I think the war has brought home to the international system of trade that the old system is done. That we are going back to a neo-mercantilist world, that freedom of navigation is no longer an international norm. The Chinese are going to do something in the Strait of Taiwan. I went and looked at a map. I read something interesting, went off and took a look at the map of all the trade that goes by sea to Japan and China. The vast majority of it go through the Strait of Taiwan. It saves them steaming time, and it saves them a lot of money and oil, and fuel. And so rather than go around Taiwan on the Philippine side, they're cutting through what should be international waters. But the Chinese, I have this old saying in our household here that the trouble with history is that we all learn the wrong lessons. and instead of learning the right lessons, don't start wars, we're like, no, we're just going to be better at fighting wars. Okay. So those chumps, they fought with bows and arrows. Well, we're going to fight with muskets. Uh, and I think that this is, the Chinese are looking at this and going, you know what? If we want to bring Taiwan into the fold, which, by the way, its naval strategists say will happen in 2027, they already have gamed out, taken Taiwan by force in 2027. I don't think they have to.
The opposition representatives in Taiwan have been trying to establish channels with the PRC.
Yeah,
don't know enough about that yet, but we've seen the examples, for example, of opposition leader having direct talks in Beijing, et cetera, et cetera. So there's interesting things going on there. Also, it's a little bit of a dovetailing on this in a sense, but coming back to the summit between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, even if Xi Jinping was speaking to an audience beyond Trump's ears, it seemed like some of the messages were, you need to agree not to meddle in our backyard, meaning Taiwan. We don't know how much is going on there from the point of view of what the outcome is going to be, medium, even long term. But Trump, obviously, yeah, sure, that part about industrial resilience, with China being such a significant player in the aspirations of progress around the world, that's the reality of today. Where do you see this? What came out of that meeting? Just to dovetail that a bit, that would speak to this point.
Yeah, well, first of all, just as a brief sidebar, the irony of the KMT opposition going to Beijing to talk nice with Xi, the KMT party is Chiang Kai-shek's party.
Yeah.
It's the party that he fled with when he went to the island of Formosa. So the irony that they're now, trying to make peace with the Chinese.
One of the things that perhaps would be the olive branch would be in Taiwan's constitution, they remove the elements that say they have the right to reclaim the mainland, as they would refer it.
Yeah, it might help.
So sure. Good luck with that, and that might be something that they can kind of, there's a lot of things relating to in the Asian communities relating to politics where you save face. Sometimes we don't read the tea leaves very well from the outside of what is going on. When I say we, I mean Western-leaning countries. And that's be an interesting one to follow here. But I'm fascinated from the point of view of industrial resilience and how what we are seeing now and how that can be applied, perhaps.
Okay, but let's focus on some of the other aspects of the summit, which I think were behind Xi's remarks about the Thucydides trap, because he was speaking from a position of dominance. Explain why,
it was,
and how the symbolism suggests that he knows that he's in the driver's seat. The subject of Taiwan was not brought up by the United States once. They did not mention it. Chalk win to Xi. All Xi talked about in private meetings was Taiwan. The Yanks didn't want to touch it. And I say the audience was Taiwan. Because if you think the United States is going to invoke its security guarantee and go to war with China over Taiwan, you are high. It's over. I mean, this is why I've been saying it's over now for weeks. But everything is changing. But this is the most incredible thing. And you're right about the tea leaves. I fortunately, when I was in Singapore, the department that I was in had a lot of really good China experts. And again, fluent in Mandarin, even though some of them were Western, some were actually either Korean or Singaporean. The point is, uh, the U.S., the U.S. press, even our press here, because we're so derivative, uh, focused on Trump and Air Force One and the pomp and circumstance and lada, lada, lada. In China, in its domestic press, coverage of the presidential visit was relegated to the third page of newspapers and was the fourth or fifth story in the evening news. They had factory ribbon cutting ceremonies in, Jiangyin province before mention of Trump. Now that's heavy duty because what
Okay.
it's saying is we are more than equal to you. In the priority list, you're behind a factory ribbon cutting.
Yeah.
And during the visit, the president of Kazakhstan arrived in Beijing and was given the exact same treatment that Trump was. His plane looked different, but in terms of people making noise and doing a little dancing on the red carpet, he got the same treatment. He got the president of Kazakhstan. So the symbolism from the Chinese, coupled with beware the Thucydides trap, suggests that they know that the baton has been passed. The U.S. doesn't know it yet. It's going to hold on, struggle to get it back. And that's where conflict starts.
Yeah,
And
dangerous.
so this was a major win for the Chinese. Uh, it is a major defeat. And I said this to a friend. I said it actually to my son. My oldest son, lives in the States. I said, okay, this is the double whammy. First, Iran comes, absorbs 38 days of bombing, takes all the blows, takes major hits to its leadership, and it's still standing. No regime change, no uranium stockpiles seized. And now Trump is saying that he doesn't care about Americans' financial situation. His main priority is to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Well, guess what? The deal with Iran that Obama had struck, he canceled. And what he wants now is to go back basically to the deal that Obama had struck. So it's a paper tiger.
Yeah.
The Iranians do the military work, okay? They just resist. They dig down, they don't change, and then they extract a price with the toll booth system in the Strait of Hormuz. Everybody now is paying a price. So the pressure is not on the Iranians, it's back on the Yanks to just stop. And that, of course, leaves Israel hanging. And I'm a little worried about Netanyahu wanting to use nukes to
Yeah.
finish the job, but that's a sidebar. The second part uh, of this is China. China just came up. Its own people didn't see the coverage that we saw. The American press, and unfortunately our press, because they're so slavish, parroted what the Americans were saying. And it was, yeah, so we cut a few trade deals and, this, that, and the other. No, you never mentioned Taiwan. You got less in the trade deals that you were promising a month before the trip. And you've now been warned that your continued attempt to keep China down is not going to go well, not at all. And I think that Western Europe uh, is taking note of that, is realizing, we may have to go back to a world where we don't like the other country's political system or how it treats its people, but we've overextended ourselves with this whole liberalism. We've really overdone it. Many countries now want to be able to use their relative power for whatever strategic advantage. We've become a bit of a Hobbesian state of nature out there. And that's where we're headed. And the more, to me, in my mind, the more people realize that the old system is over. I mean, there may be some remnants. The World Health Organization might be able to hang around. I'd like the International Labor Organization to hang around, although it's very Eurocentric. But in terms of defense and basic systems of trade, the World Bank, the International Monetary Firm, they got to go. Okay, they don't represent the global South. See, there's a
No.
so much coming, and the institutions are not responding. But I think that was Xi's biggest message, was to that broader audience and going, the old system is done. And now it's a matter of accommodating, what will you retain and what will you accommodate us on when it comes to a more South-centric and nationalistic system of trade. We're going to see more protectionism, all those sort of things, and people need to adjust. Well, businesses need to adjust. And, as I mentioned before, after the pandemic, most of them went back to business as usual. This war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has shown you cannot do that. And I'm thinking I have to give a professional talk to a construction lobby in a few weeks. And most of the cement sourced in New Zealand, but sourced around the world, comes from China. And they've got a stranglehold. But no one's ever looked at other options that might be more expensive, but might not be as subject to, blackmail, extortion. I was thinking specifically of Brazil. If New Zealand construction entities were to look eastward rather than northward, it will cost them more money per kilo of cement. But Brazil has ample capability to not replace China, but certainly substitute in the marketplace a big, portion of what we now get from the Chinese, and so on and so forth. It's time to look laterally and then look at your own processes. Again, this just-in-time production model needs to be reviewed. As simple as that. So, between AI, the advances coming with AI, given that the technological advances in telecommunications and transportation are going to continue apace, it's actually a moment of opportunity for to commit to industrial resilience. Change the business models operative at the moment. And yes, during the transition moment, you'll lose a little money because you're investing in new things. But on the other hand, the longer term returns will be better than clinging to a model that is increasingly obsolescent.
And I would argue that where institutional lag exists and where it's obvious, that think small, think microeconomics, think response to this, map out a way forward, think individualistically, independently in that context for the greater good. And perhaps that nimble-footed approach is the way to navigate opportunity and potential in days like this. Paul, thank you very much for a stimulating talk. Thanks to the audience that's hung in there, even when we had a bit of a break in transmission for a while there in the first quarter of the episode. That should stitch together very nicely in YouTube for those that watch it on demand. So thanks again. Once again, if people want to keep that conversation going, I know Paul in particular will be watching those comments. So on YouTube, feel free to wade in there. A lot of material there, and thank you and salute you for that, Paul. It's a great episode. So until we're back, we'll be back in June it's probably around the middle of June, I think, is where we land on such things, and we'll look forward to that. And we just want to, once again, thank you for the investment of your time in watching this episode. Until then, on behalf of Paul and I, ka kite anō, as we say in New Zealand, have a good and safe month ahead of you until we all meet again online like this. Bye-bye for now.